Hi everyone, the last set I want to do for this past week is the nervous system and muscles, in other words, innervation, amongst a couple of other things. And we've had discussions around it. It's kind of gone back and forth, but I just want to sort of um, look at, sort of a more in-depth, shall we say. Not certainly not to the in-depth you're going to get in your neuro class, but beginning anyways. So the first thing we're going to talk about efferent nerves. Efferent means these are nerves that leave the central nervous system or the spinal cord and go to the muscles. So they're motor neurons. So what does it mean when we say that a muscle is innervated by a certain nerve? Well, what we're going to be looking at here is, looking at nerves and their nerve supply to muscles. It's very rare that there's variations in the nerve supply of muscles. So there might be minor changes, but ultimately when we look at it, most muscles are innervated by the same nerves. And the other thing to remember is a skeletal muscle is under what we call conscious control. In other words, when we want to perform a task, we initiate the movement that's required. Now, you may not know, you're not consciously aware of every single movement that's occurring in the task. That is all coordinated by your brain. But again, you decide you want to perform a task and it is initiated by the central nervous system. Therefore, there must be some way for the message to go from the brain, ultimately, to the specific muscles needed to perform the job required. And when we look here, we can see that we have what are called motor neurons or motor nerve cells that do initiate the beginnings of the movement. Now, up here at the higher level in the brain, not only is it is initiated here, but understand that this area also coordinates the movement. So when we learn how to perform a task, there has to be initiation or coordination of said movement. So certain muscles have to contract a certain way, other muscles need to be inhibited, and so on and so forth. So it all starts up here at the top in the brain, and then it works its way down through the midbrain to the pons. Now, what's interesting here is we have to consider that these neurons that are going to initiate this movement, they start, in this case we're seeing here, it's on the right side of the brain that's going to affect the left side structure. So there's a crossing over that occurs at the medulla. So this is why if someone has a stroke on the right side in the brain, it affects the left side of the body. So the message comes down through the brain into the lower parts of the brain where it crosses over at the medulla and then travels down the spinal cord to go out to innervate the muscles. So what does it mean when we say that a muscle is innervated by a certain nerve? What we're looking at here, again, we're looking at these variations. Sorry, I went the wrong way. Nerves pass into and out of the spinal column. So when nerves are passing into the spinal column, if we remember here the very first slide, efferent nerves go from the nervous system to the muscle. Afferent, so we start with, instead of E, we start with A. Afferent muscles go into the spinal cord and the system. So nerves pass into sensory and out of motor, the spinal column, and these are called spinal nerves. Of course, there are 31 pair. The nerves that innervate the muscle are called motor nerves because they're going to initiate the movement. Spinal nerves from C1 to C7 exit superior to their corresponding vertebrae, and C8 exists between C7 and T1. Now, there is no C8 vertebra, but it is the transition area. We then get below that, the spinal nerves T1 to L5, they exit inferior to their corresponding vertebrae. So that we can see up here, if this were an L spine, if this was L5, this would be the L5 nerve root. So we can see all the branches that occur. So this isn't even the spinal cord. The spinal cord would run a straight line down through the middle here. These are all the neurons that either exit or enter into. In this case, this is generally in yellow are the motor neurons, and they head out to innervate the specific muscles to cause contractions and therefore movement. The spinal nerves of the C-spine innervate the arm, diaphragm, muscles of the neck, and extrinsic muscles of the back, such as levator scapula and rhomboids. The spinal nerves of the thoracic spine innervate such structures as pectoralis major, intercostal muscles, serratus anterior and posterior. The spinal nerves of the lumbar spine innervate such structures as muscles of the abdominal wall, muscles related to the reproductive structures, and muscles related to the hip joint and parts of the leg. The spinal nerves of the sacrum innervate such structures as the anal region, some pelvic muscles, and muscles of the lower leg. We can see here, working our way down, we've got the cervical spine muscles here, thoracic here, lumbar here, and then the large branches coming out of the sacrum. When spinal nerves enter into the body, they're given specific names according to the regions they can pass through, possibly their length, or structures they're associated with or close to. So for example, quadriceps femoris is innervated by the femoral nerve L2, L3, and L4, hence where it runs in its name. And as we've talked about before, you'll note that in the previous one I've just mentioned here, 2 of the nerves are bolded and 1 isn't. The bolded numbers are the major innervators of the specific muscle. So sometimes there's 2 black numbers, sometimes there's only 1. If a major innervator is destroyed, the muscle is unable to contract fully, and if all levels are disrupted, such as in a spinal cord injury, the muscle can't function at all. So we can see here in the diagram, in the case of the lumbar area, we can see the nerves that are heading out. In this case, an anterior view here, we can see the lumbar nerves and the sacral nerves. Posteriorly, we can see here one major nerve that's created with a culmination of many is called the sciatic nerve, but we can see them traveling all the way down, both anterior and posterior, to innervate all the structures that we find distally. Now, the afferent nerves are from the muscles to the nervous system. And we've talked a little bit about the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organ. And I'm not going to spend a whole much on the Golgi tendon organ because we've talked a bit about that already, but I do want to speak to the muscle spindle. I did mention it briefly when we did PNF in theory, but I want to spend a little more time on this one. So a muscle spindle is actually a proprioceptor, which means that it is the one that's giving information at any given time to the central nervous system. So in brackets here, we say that the muscle spindle is a proprioceptor, and this allows us to know where our head and limbs are and how we're moving, even if we're not looking at them at any given time with a muscle. The other thing a muscle spindle does as well, it participates in what is known as the stretch reflex. These proprioceptors, within the context of these, they work on setting the overall muscle tone that's controlled by the cerebellum, which is a part of the brain. So, we talk about dead weight when someone's unconscious. Well, when someone's unconscious, the tone's not really being controlled, hence the reason why everything's kind of flaccid and not moving, because the stretch reflex is not working. These muscle spindles that are all part of this, they're interspersed very much amongst skeletal muscle fibers. So we can see here in the diagram that we've got our normal muscle fibers here that make up the muscle. We talked about that earlier in one of the slides, this set, where we've got, everything all kind of surrounded. Well, we're looking at a specific muscle fiber and the groups of them. Embedded in and around these groups of muscle fibers, we find the muscle spindle, and we can see it's this encapsulated structure within and between muscle fibers. Their whole role is to monitor changes in the length of a skeletal muscle and participate in what's called the stretch reflex. So when this is stimulated, when it's stretched, it causes contraction to shorten the muscle that's stretching. So we say it causes contraction of a skeletal muscle in response to stretching of that muscle. When we look at the muscle spindle, it consists of several slowly adopting sensory nerve endings that wrap around 3 to 10 specialized muscle fibers called intrafusal fibers. So if we go back to this picture here, we can see these are specialized muscle cells here. And because they're in the capsule, they're called intrafusal muscle fibers. So again, right, we can see here that in this we can see these intrafusal fibers. And as I said, they're surrounded by a connective tissue capsule, and that capsule anchors the spindle to the endomysium and perimysium of the muscle itself. So again, anytime a muscle creates tension, it gets picked up by this proprioceptor. And so we can see that we have these efferent, remember, from the cord to the muscle, motor, causes muscle to contract, and afferent, muscles that are fibers, nerve fibers that are sensory in nature. We can see how these afferent fibers wrap around these interfusal fibers, and at any point they are in fact actually, right, they're measuring length of muscle. So it causes contraction of a skeletal muscle in response to stretching of that muscle. Muscles that produce finely controlled movements have many spindles in them. So we have lots of muscle spindles in our fingers and eyes and so forth. Coarser but more powerful muscles, such as quads and hamstrings, don't have many muscle spindles at all. So we can see here again, here's our GTO. We can see here, right, in the tendon itself, but the muscle spindle is embedded within the muscle fibers. And again, because it's encapsulated in a connective tissue capsule, they're called intrafusal muscles. And outside the capsule, these would be called extrafusal muscles, just your normal skeletal muscle and its associated structures. So again, we can see the sensory neurons here wrapping around, right, measuring length, and then we have motor neurons that are going to have them contract as well. So within these muscle spindles, we do have these sensory fibers that are measuring length, but we also have a couple of motor neurons called gamma motor neurons. Now, these come in through the capsule and terminate near both ends of the intrafusal fibers within the capsule. And these are all about adjusting tension in the spindle to various lengths of the muscle. So, for example, in a biceps curl, when we start the process of this exercise, these gamma motor neurons stimulate the ends of the intrafusal fibers, and this causes them to slightly contract. And this is happening because as the action of the bicep curl starts, of course, the biceps muscles are going to get shorter, which means less stretch. Well, the intrafusal muscle fibers would shorten as well. The problem is if they were allowed to shorten too much, we wouldn't get appropriate feedback, and we wouldn't get the reaction of the messages getting back to the spinal cord. So as the intrafusal fibers shorten, the motor neurons, these gamma motor neurons, will stimulate the intrafusal muscle fibers to slightly shorten or contract. This means that it maintains a sensitivity to the stretching of the muscle at any given time. So it's important that, upon shortening, that these intrafusal fibers are stimulated to shorten. It helps gain better proprioceptive control of the muscle. Now, surrounding the spindle are normal skeletal muscle fibers, and I said they are called extrafusal muscle fibers. Now, they're nerves that stimulate their contraction, right, normal contraction of any muscle. They're supplied by a larger diameter motor neuron. Now, picture that the larger the diameter, the faster and the more information can travel through it. So, of course, we want quick reactions. So where the internal intrafusal muscle fibers are innervated by the gamma motor neurons, right, the skeletal muscle themselves, the extrafusal fibers, are stimulated or supplied by large diameter alpha motor neurons, which means they're very fast. Impulses in the muscle spindle sensory nerves enter into the spinal cord and brainstem and activate the alpha motor neurons, which causes the muscle to contract to relieve the stretching. So we talked about when we were doing stretching in theory, how if we stretch a muscle too far, we get jerking motions, and we use this as a measure. The body's telling us that we've stretched too far, and the muscle therefore is attempting to contract to shorten back up. So again, the muscle spindle measures the length. It's getting too long. It sends a message through the afferent nerves, those ones that wrap around, and then we get a motor neuron that is a alpha motor neuron that causes the muscle that's stretching to contract because it's getting too long or getting too stretched. So we can see it here. We've got the intrafusal muscles here in the capsule. We've got these afferent sensory nerves here that are measuring length. We have these efferent motor nerves, that tend to, if the muscle's getting too shortened, to have them slightly contract. And of course, we have extrafusal afferents and efferents as well. So again, we stretch this too long, we'll get this measurement here from the afferent nerves to say it's getting too long, and then we'll get a efferent uh, uh, message here causing the extrafusal muscles to contract to prevent it from stretching too long. I'm not going to go into the Golgi tendon organ. It's here if you wish to review it. We already went through it in theory class. This is the last set for this. There will be quiz material on this tomorrow. I apologize for the length of time. I've been off and unwell. I'll try to make it as best as possible. I might even actually have the quiz a couple days later, which will give you an opportunity to go through this material. Thanks again.